week. He is in the section that he has been for all of chapter 13 and chapter 14, where he is desiring to talk with God after he rebukes his friends. And he's been talking in verses 1 through 12 of chapter 14. God knows the troubled condition of man. And what we're going to look at in this section, starting in verse 7, is the finality of death. He's feeling very hopeless. But let's start in verse 1 and we'll read down through verse 17. Man that is born of a woman is of few days and full of trouble. He cometh forth like a flower and is cut down. He fleeth also as a shadow and continueth not. And dost thou open thine eyes upon such an one, and bringest me into judgment with thee? Who can bring a clean thing out of an unclean? Not one. Seeing his days are determined, the number of his months are with thee. Thou hast appointed his bounds that he cannot pass. Turn from him that he may rest, till he shall accomplish as an hireling his day. For there is hope of a tree, if it be cut down, that it will sprout again, and that the tender branch thereof will not cease. Though the root thereof wax old in the earth, and the stock thereof die in the ground, yet through the scent of water it will bud, and bring forth boughs like a plant. But man dieth, and wasteth away. Yea, man giveth up the ghost, and where is he? As the waters fail from the sea, and the flood decayeth and drieth up, so man lieth down and riseth not, till the heavens be no more. They shall not awake, nor be raised out of their sleep. Oh, that thou wouldest hide me in the grave, that thou wouldest keep me secret until thy wrath be past, that thou wouldest appoint me a set time, and remember me. If a man die, shall he live again? All the days of my appointed time will I wait, till my change come. Thou shalt call, and I will answer thee. Thou wilt have a desire to the work of thine hands. For now thou numberest my steps. Dost thou not watch over my sin? My transgression is sealed up in a bag, and thou sewest up mine iniquity. Let's bow for a word of prayer. Father, as Job is longing for better days and is struggling under the weight of the tough ones, some days are like that, and some days we wonder if it's worth it. But for him, the most difficult part is not hearing from you. And he longs again for a time when the relationship is going to be right again. And when you see him differently than he anticipates that you see him now. But a lot of times when we are prone to wonder and to question and to struggle, it's always good to do what he does and go back to your unfailing character. You always want what is best for the people that you love. And Job is going to relish in that from time to time and struggle with the reality of his difficulty. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Lord knows the troubled condition of man. He has been talking to God. This is a very personal conversation, and it's going to get more personal. Verses 13 and 14 are kind of a highlight of these two chapters. This is the very close, deep reaching out of Job's heart. But he starts off continuing this argument in verses 7 through 9 that at least a tree has hope. A man is different from any of the rest of creation. You cut off a blade of grass and it grows back. And he's using this example here that of all these earthly things that have some hope within them, even though they appear to be dead. You fell a tree and it looks dead. You have just a stump there. And it doesn't take long before the sun and everything starts to work on it. And sometimes it splits open and sometimes it starts to turn gray. And you think that it is all dead and gone. But what Job is saying is there's always the hidden possibility of new life that could spring again. I don't know if you're familiar with a lot of trees, but poplar trees, my goodness, they're hard to kill. You cut a poplar tree and it looks like it's dead, and sometimes it'll even crack the top of the stump. But it usually doesn't take weeks or months, and certainly not until the next spring, and you'll see little shoots start back up again. Well, you can take your chainsaw, you can cut it down again, but don't be surprised if it doesn't sprout out, until you get it almost down to the ground. If you don't pour some salt on it or something to kill that thing out, it just keeps coming back. And that's Job's point here. The hidden possibility of new life springing up is the difference between a tree and a man. Now, some of the words that he uses are very picturesque. You would expect that in poetry. Sprout. A sprout is something that is a sign of renewal. It's something that springs up. It's one of the first signs that there is life in something. And so he says, there's hope of a tree, if it be cut down, that it will sprout again. It'll show that very first sign that maybe everything isn't over for that tree. There's a little something left. And then he goes to and that the tender branch thereof will appear. A tender branch is a same word as a young twig, and we're starting to see that now. Fruit trees are starting to bud out a little bit, and you've got those tiny little parts of new growth that weren't there last year. That's what it's referring to. And so he's saying, and then there's continued evidence of life. And that continued evidence of life brings with it an expectation for real growth in the future. And so what he's doing is he's saying, well, that tree looks like it's all dead, but it has hope lying within it. And then it's going to just a little sign. And then it's going to start to grow a little bit bigger sign, and you're like, oh man, this is going to be cool. Pine or apple trees look like they're doing good. Peach trees look like they're doing good. The grapes are starting to spring out and grow, and there's an expectation that if I just wait a while, there's going to be plenty to harvest. There's going to be good times ahead. That's the picture that he is drawing here. And in verse 8, he says, it might seem like life has gone, though the root thereof wax old in the earth. I did not know this of a persimmon tree, but we had a customer who had a pretty good sized persimmon tree out next to his house, and it got struck by lightning. And it absolutely killed the tree, split the trunk and killed it. And he went down there and cut it off, just left a little bit of a stump there, because he didn't want the dead part, falling and hurting anyone or falling on a building. Went back the next spring and he said, any of you boys want any persimmon trees? You'll have to dig them out of the ground down there. So I went down there and thought, it'd be cool to have a couple of persimmon trees. What I didn't realize is the bud was actually coming out of the root itself. So you dig down, couple of feet down into the ground, and you thought you were going to get a rooted tree from the nut or whatever, and that's not what happened. See, when the lightning hit the top of the tree, it boiled the sap and blew the thing to pieces. But the life was still in the root. And so all of these little trees were springing out of that root, even though it seemed on the surface that it was dead. The proof just kept popping up through the ground. And the stalk here that it refers to in verse 8 is the stump. It looks dead and dried up, and then all of a sudden it comes to life again. And he talks about that in verse 9. And very picturesque again. Yet through the scent of water. Well, when I was a kid, old timers used to say, man, we better get to the house. It smells like rain. And I'd be sitting there going, I don't smell nothing. But it didn't take long being out with my grandfather. He'd say, I don't know, Robbie, I think we better head to the house. It feels like it's going to rain. And we'd be a little bit later, he'd stop and he'd say, yeah, it smells like rain. We're going to get a good one. And I'm thinking, you're joking. But you can smell rain coming. I mean, once you understand, what's going on and get used to it, you can smell the rain coming. But smelling the rain coming is a far cry from water in the ground that actually helps the plant. And so what he's saying here is that even though that it seems that life has gone, the right conditions prove that the hope is not gone. Because the scent of the water, in other words, what he's saying is it doesn't really take much. It just takes a little bit to coax something that looks dead and have it spring back to life again. And the way that it describes it here, it will bud and then it will bring forth boughs like a plant. A bud is the start of life outwardly, but bough is a far different word than he used up in the previous verse. This is a full-grown branch. This isn't the little twig that's growing that promises that there's going to be life. And so what he says is, very quickly a tree goes from, ooh, there's a scent of water and the conditions are right, and it pops up the first evidence of life, to here is a tree that is beneficial. It is a reapable crop, or it's the limb of a tree. It's representing a mature life. And Job's sitting here saying, man, wouldn't I love to be a tree about now? Because I feel like you just keep cutting me off and cutting me off and cutting me off. But at least a tree, if the conditions were right, maybe I could see in the future a time where I would bud a little bit, and my life would have some promise to it. And maybe it would get to the point where I have full-blown boughs again, big, large branches that are able to bear fruit and provide shade. Wouldn't that be wonderful? But then in verses 10 through 12, he uses all of that illustration for some contrast, because he says man's life is far different. But man dieth and wasteth away. In other words, death removes all hope. When you waste away, it is decay. This is ashes to ashes, dust to dust. So you cut off a tree and the conditions are right, it's coming back. That doesn't happen with me, God. That's what Job's saying. You cut me down and I die, and that's it. I don't have another opportunity to live this life. He giveth up the ghost, and where is he? Giving up the ghost, literally, the word that is used for this phrase, giving up the ghost, means to breathe out. And it is the opposite of what God did to Adam in the garden. He breathed into him the breath of life. And so what the Bible is describing here, when a man dies, when he expires, when he passes away, he is breathing out that last breath of life that was in him. And that's the picture that Job is using here. And so when you breathe out that last breath of life, there's nothing left in reserve. It's not a motorcycle. You just reach down and turn the knob and you use the reserve tank to get back home or to a gas station to fill up. No, he's saying once that last breath is gone, there's nothing left. And where is he is kind of a weird way of translating this, because most of the older versions say, and is no more. And that's the point that Job is trying to make here. While the tree has hope that it could spring back and actually have a mature life and a productive life, man is not that way, because once the breath is gone out of him, he is no more. There isn't hope again. He uses some illustrations here as if the tree wasn't enough to get it across. But what's really interesting in verse 11 with these two illustrations is this shows our utter dependence on God. He's going to talk about a dried up river or a lake. And he says, as the waters fail from the sea. Okay? Doesn't say in the sea. It says the waters fail from the sea. That's important. And then the second one, excuse me, and the flood decayeth and drieth up. He starts off with a body of water that is dependent upon a source to keep it from going dry. And that's what he's talking about here in these examples. As the waters fail from the sea, what can the sea do about it? Nothing. Now, last year when it started to get dry and all the creeks were way, way down, you could go up to Flanagan to fish, and you'd say, what controls the height of Flanagan Dam? And everybody'd say, well, the Corps of Engineers does. Yes and no. To a certain extent they do. But if there's no water coming in, Eventually, by contract, they have to allow so much to go out because it feeds folks downstream from us. But you could tell that even though we were supposed to be at full pull was going down in the middle of summer because they were letting out their guaranteed amount of water. But guess what's coming in from all the creeks in our area? It was less than what was going out. And so you could tell that until we would get rain, the lake would start to drop, and then we get some good rain and it would come back up a little bit and it would drop. That's the illustration that he's talking about here. You could close the gates on Flanagan, and if there's no rain, is it ever going to fill up from the winter level? No. It would just, you've got to have water running into it to either increase its depth or to maintain its depth. And then he says, the flood decayeth and drieth up. The point is, if there's no source, there's no future. And it's gone. And that's what he's talking about. He is referring back to the statement that he just said about man's life. Once you breathe out the last breath of life, and that's controlled by God, then there's nothing that you can do about it. There's nothing any more than the lake can do about wanting water, or you imagine out in desert regions where they get these flash floods. They can be awful. We saw that last year in Texas. Amounts of water that are hard to imagine, and then days later it's almost like the creek is dried up, and you drive through there and think, how did 13 feet of water come down through this creek? Well, that's what he's talking about. The reality that he lays down, so man lieth down and riseth not. He's not getting back up again from death. It's the great equalizer. But he goes on and he says, till the heavens be no more, they shall not awake, nor be raised out of their sleep. In other words, he's going to tie verses 10 and 11 together here, and he says, until something outside acts on a dead body of a man, it's dead. And so what he's actually saying is, I am looking forward to the bodily resurrection. Because when the heavens are no more, then we will awake and be raised out of our sleep. But not until then, because there's nothing in and of ourselves that we can do about it. Now, what's interesting is he talks about end of time. Who controls that? God does. Awake out of their sleep. Who controls that? God does. So what he's saying here is, while a tree in and of itself might keep some life in the trunk or in the root, and given the proper set of circumstances, it could bring back and have a bright future again. And Job is saying that's not man, because once man dies, that's it. And some outside force, obviously being God, is going to act on that body before there is a resurrection. Now, he takes all that in verses 13 through 17 to talk about his hope after death. And it's kind of beautiful the way he describes this before reality hits him again here at the end of the chapter. He has a personal request in verses 13 and 14. Oh, that thou wouldest hide me in the grave, that thou wouldest keep me secret until thy wrath be past, that thou wouldest appoint me a set time, and remember me. His personal request, Lord, I wish you would just let me die. And you say, boy, that seems pretty harsh. But it gives us a glimpse into how much Job is suffering. Because he's looking at this and he's saying, hide me. From what? From the present misery. He's saying, why don't you just let me die, because you're the one that controls that. And hide me in the grave where all of this stuff that's been happening to me can't bother me anymore. And then you remember me and bring me back again. A similar description is used in Isaiah chapter 26. Now, I want to turn there and read it to you because it's not a foreign thought just to Job. But in Isaiah chapter 26, starting in verse 19 and down through 21, we see a very similar description. The dead men shall live, Together with my dead body shall they arise. Awake and sing, ye that dwell in dust. For the dew is as the dew of herbs, and the earth shall cast out the dead. Come, my people, enter thou into thy chambers, and shut thy doors about thee. That is a very poetic way of saying die. Hide thyself, as it were. Now notice, he says, for a little moment, until the indignation be overpast. For behold, the Lord cometh out of his place to punish the inhabitants of the earth for their iniquity. The earth also shall disclose her blood, and shall no more cover her slain. This is describing the end of times, when God is coming back to judge the day of the Lord. And he's saying, sometimes you look at a situation and you say, well, I don't know, life seems really short. But from this picture, he's saying, those that pass on before the tribulation starts and before the rapture comes are resting and missing all the nonsense in between. And when the Lord has judged sin and there is a bodily resurrection and he brings everybody up out of the grave, you've missed all the indignation of wrath on sin. Very, very similar situation to what Job is asking for. And it's kind of incredible because Job is one of the earliest books. So if you think about how early he's writing this, it's incredible how good his doctrine is and how complete an understanding he has of God. And it shouldn't be shocking because God's holding him up as a righteous and just individual before Satan. But that's what it is. Notice the phrase that he uses here, keep me secret. Now, why does that seem like such a big deal? I'll tell you why. Because secret from whom? It's not secret from God, right? Actually, he's the one keeping the secret. And so it's like, you go ahead and put me in the grave until all of this nonsense from this earthly life are gone. And you just keep me there a secret. Basically what he's saying is, known only to yourself. You hide me from all this trouble, and you keep me secret. And if you're the only one that knows, then nobody else can be a bother to me. And think about what his friends have done here in the last couple of chapters. Every single one of them has had an opportunity to be an encouragement to Job, but instead they've taken a shot at him. And now he's saying, if I were a secret known only to you, my friends couldn't treat me that way. Nobody could treat me that way. And he's saying, until the wrath be past, I will be safe until the present situation is over with. Then, and here's why I say this is the high point of it, and this demonstrates such a personal relationship here. He says, remember me. Remember me. You set a time that only you know. Acts chapter 1, verse 7. It is not for you to know the times and the seasons. God holds that to himself. Job saying, I'm okay with that. Because I know your character and I trust in it. I understand your will and I trust in it. I don't have to know, but if you set a time, then I know that you will keep it because I am trusting in the very character of God himself, his faithfulness, his goodness, his unfailingness, his eternality. He says, remember me. Visit me again in better conditions. Visit me again when my body has paid for the sin. Visit me again when I get to be reunited with body and spirit in resurrection. And I look forward to that day. Because there's not really a whole lot to look forward to in this day. And then he talks about the finality of death here. If a man die, shall he live again? In other words, he's saying, I know it ends my time on earth. I know there is no chance of any future things happening here on earth. And Job realizes in other words, he's letting his friends who are listening know that he is not making a light request here. He is not just getting emotional and going, oh, I wish I could die because I don't know if I can take this. He knows full well what he's asking God to do, and he knows the consequence of it. But look at how he describes it. All the days of my appointed time will I wait till my change come. In other words, he is willing to wait in the grave as long as it takes. I don't know when the end of the earth is going to be, Lord. It could be 50 years. It could be 100 years. It could be 1,000 years. I don't have any clue. But if you'll let me die and you will hide me in secret between you and I in the grave and then resurrect me at some future day, I will wait as long as it takes. Because I don't have anything to look forward to in this life, but I do have something to look forward to in the resurrection. And he uses a word here, change. What do they call it when a caterpillar becomes a butterfly? Chrysalis, right? Is that the term? I believe that's the term. Comes from this same word. There is another word like it in the Greek that is actually the root of that word, but this is the Hebrew counterpart, I believe is the right term for this. And that's what he's saying. The word change here, till my change come, is used in Psalm 90, verse 5 and 6, to describe grass that is springing up new. You mow it off and it looks dead in the winter, but that's what's happening now, right? It's springing up and it's turning green and it's showing promise of new life. That is the word. The rest of the time throughout the Old Testament that this term is used, it talks about a change of clothes. This is the word that Joseph used when he gave his youngest brother a change of clothes. And the point being, you looked like one thing and you represented one thing, but then when you went and changed your clothes, you looked completely different and it represents something completely different. And so Job is saying, I understand that there is going to be a complete change that's going to go on. I am willing to trade this tortured body for a new one. Now, that's what I am looking forward to. Now, think of all the people on this earth who have to walk around with difficulties that we don't understand. They're blind, or they're deaf, or they're handicapped, or, they have some situation. When they are bodily resurrected again, they're not going to have to deal with that anymore. And that's the picture that Job is looking at. He's saying, I get what I'm asking, but there is a whole lot that I get to look forward to at the resurrection, because all of this stuff that's going on right now isn't over here. The grave cleanses that. Verse 15, personal relationship. This is beautiful. Thou shalt call, and I will answer thee. God will call. That's what he's been wanting all along, right? He's been asking God to show up and say something. Tell me how I've sinned, or explain to my friends what's going on here, because I don't understand. But there's going to be a time when God will want to talk with me again, even though for whatever reason he's silent now. And I will answer. I will be glad to have a relationship restored again. And if I have to die and be resurrected for that to happen, then I'm okay with that. This word that is used here for desire, thou wilt have a desire to the work of thine hands, is a very powerful one. Genesis chapter 31 and verse 30, I'll read that to you, is the exact same word. And you can tell from the human connotation here exactly what's being said. And now, though thou wouldest needs be gone, because thou sore longest, that's our word, after thy father's house, yet wherefore hast thou stolen my gods? Jacob is leaving his employer. We know his wife stole the idols, and they're hurrying out of there, and it's obvious that they're hurrying out of there. And Jacob sees it, and he says, I know you've been gone a long time, and you desperately want to be back with your family, reunited again. That's the word that Job is using here, saying, God, your desire to me, you will want to have a relationship with me like that. Psalm 84:2 uses it, the same word with the same meaning, but in a different way. Psalm 84 in verse 2, my soul longeth, there's our word, yea, even fainteth for the courts of the Lord. My heart and my flesh crieth out for the living God. Those are intense words. And he's saying, the work of your hands new again. This is an interesting way of describing it, because thou will have a desire to the work of thine hands. Job's got a lot of questions, and one of them is probably, boy, it seems like you've been pursuing after me. Do you not know that I am a creation of your hands? He said that at least 3 or 4 times now in answering friends, and now in talking to God. But here what he's saying is, you will look on me as a cherished object again. And it's hard to punish in the way I'm being punished right now if I'm a cherished object. And if you look at me as something that you created, then you will see the intent, you will see the purpose, you will see the design. That's the way he wants to be seen of God again, because it feels like God seeing him differently, and therefore he's acting differently towards him. Now, as the readers, we have the wonderful vantage point of knowing that that's not true, right? God has not changed the way he looks at Job, and he hasn't changed the way he's treating Job because he looks at him differently. That's not what's going on at all. He's actually lifting Job up and holding him up as a wonderful example. But to Job, it sure does not feel that way, does it? Blessed changes here in verses 16 and 17. For now thou numberest my steps. Dost thou not watch over my sin? My transgression is sealed up in a bag, and thou sewest up mine iniquity. He is talking about looking forward to the resurrection, and this kind of sounds like he's taking a step back. But that's not what's happening. Numbering my steps is a different way that he is describing how God is looking at him than he has in past chapters. In past chapters, he has said it feels like he's being hunted by God. It feels like he's under the microscope, and God's just looking for every opportunity to bring some trial or some misfortune upon him. This verse, for thou numberest my steps, is the picture of a dad watching a toddler walk. There's still very, very close attention to the situation, but there's far different meaning and far different implications that happen from it. If you're very intently watching a toddler walk, it's because you love and you cherish them and you don't want them to fall and get hurt. But if you're hunting after something, you might be spending the same amount of energy and detail in watching it, but the end result and the design are exact opposites. And so he's saying that when the resurrection comes, I'm going to be in your eyes as a little child, and the way you look at me is going to be so precious and wonderful. He says, watch over my sin. Now it seems like you are watching every move to punish me. But I know that then it's going to be far different. That's what he's looking forward to. And then in the last, I have rebelled, is a good word. I know that it will be sealed up. Now, this happens sometimes in our courts. Every once in a while when something happens, judgment is handed down and then they seal the records. And once they seal the records, you're not supposed to have access to go in and look at them again. Perversity. This would be moral sins. And he uses the same term that he used before, sewest up, covers with a patch. Now, if you have a tear in a pair of pants, you put a patch on it and you sew it up, you can't see the tear anymore. That's the picture of what he's saying here. It's covered by a patch. When we talk about our sins being forgiven and we are justified, we often use the phrase, just as if it never happened. and chooses to treat it as if it never happened, as if the person is completely made whole. And Job's saying, while I know that it happened, when resurrection day comes, I am going to be treated as if it never happened, and I'm never going to have to deal with it again, because that's the biblical term for forgiving and forgetting. That's what God does. He knows about every single sin, but he chooses to forgive it, and then he puts it aside as far as the east is from the west. He knowingly and willingly chooses to forget that sin. Job says, boy, I really, really look forward to that day. And then after this beautiful conversation with God, he's going to come struggling in again as he finishes up the chapter, knowing that he is sitting in a reality that is far different from what he is looking for on Resurrection Day. I'm glad somebody said, we need to study the book of Job. We've never studied the book of Job. Because I'll tell you, I've read through this, and it's not an easy study. I don't know if you can tell. There are times it takes me an hour and a half or 2 hours just to get started on one message, because it's a little rough, and I have a bunch of commentaries, and it's poetry, and so, you want to rightly divide God's word. But one thing that I just am amazed at, no wonder God held Job up and said, here is a righteous man. Because even in the midst of the worst of it, he constantly talks about God in such great and glowing terms. And he always has great doctrine when he does it. And even though he's saying, man, I wish I could die, it's not having a pity party. Because he knows that God is good, and however long he has to wait, there's coming a time when he gets resurrected, and man, is it ever going to be worth it. You think about not having the New Testament and not having the life of Christ and all of the things to be able to draw from, and yet here is a person who is rooted and grounded in his God. And that's why I keep saying, I am convinced to the soul of my core of my soul, that the thing that is hurting Job the most isn't losing the kids or losing the farm or the sickness that he's dealing with. The thing that's bothering Job the worst is the silence of God in the worst of difficulty. And yet he absolutely refuses to say anything wrong about the God he worships. Praises or prayer requests tonight?